Spoiler alert for Spider-Man No Way Home. After two forgettable, light-hearted MCU Spider-Man movies, I didn't have much anticipation for this movie, but Marvel has once again mastered the best way in Hollywood to steal your cash. Spider-Man No Way Home goes back on track for Tom Holland Spider-Man, finally adding some weight and ethical dilemma for the title character, providing genuine and satisfying feeling which has been depressingly absent in the MCU for a long time. Ever since Holland's Spider-Man has been introduced in the MCU, one thing that got celebrated was the reduction of Uncle Ben's death, so that the audience don't have to repeatedly experience the whole Uncle Ben is killed scenario shown in the two previous Spider-Man versions. MCU has in turn created a carefree, fun, lightweight juvenile who doesn't feel like Spider-Man at all. Spider-Man has always been the superhero closest to a relatable ordinary person. He takes care of his aunt-maid, marries his high school sweetheart, and struggles to balance work, family, and superhero tasks. Thus, he's the most realistic superhero without having to be born or raised in unique circumstances. But the MCU Peter Parker has too much privilege and too few worries. He got a decent life supported by his aunt, tactic aid from Tony Stark, babysitting from all kinds of adults, a loyal best friend to help him play superhero. His biggest worries are getting his girlfriend and being a more mature superhero. I'll call this the unbearable likeness of Spider-Man. Some people certainly love this fun, light-hearted version of Spider-Man, yet I always find it problematic to avoid Uncle Ben's death in a Spider-Man story. One important aspect of this specific plot is to transform Peter Parker from a reckless teenager into a likable character with lots of emotional depth who an audience would greatly sympathize with. Remember in the beginning of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire Peter Parker was also a bit flawed, initially used his new gain abilities for personal profit by becoming a professional wrestler so to impress his girl, even with all his humble favorable quality. Only after Uncle Ben's death, ridden by guilt and inspired by the morality his uncle has already practiced, he truly became the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man which we all know and love. Even for Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man in those amazingly filmed yet badly written dumpster fire, he still went through the same transformation from a total irresponsible jerk to a slightly more serious guy within one movie, partially because of Uncle Ben's death as well. Even not Peter Parker, but Miles Morales in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse also experienced his villain's uncle's death and grow up within one movie. MCU is only able to do the same thing after two Spider-Man movies, and I'm not even counting other MCU movies Holland has appeared in. In the scriptwriting book Save the Cat, one rule is simple and obvious: you must make the protagonist a likable character. Of course, we all love Holland's Spider-Man as well, but we care for him in the way we care for a kid-lost little puppy. The previous MCU Spider-Man movies were intended for children, and the way Holland's Peter was written into an immature kid, always shadowing the fact that he was around the same age as the previous Spider-Man's versions. We never view this Peter as a true hero and carry him the way we care for Tony Stark or Steve Rogers. Holland's Peter is particularly unlikable in Far From Home and throughout most of No Way Home. We all know what happened in Far From Home was the consequences of his reckless action. But even after all those dramas, he still got happy and Stephen Strange to clean up his mess. And he was still discontent and in turn created the whole plot of No Way Home. With Aunt May's death being a serious consequences and the collapse of the multi-universe as actual stake, Holland's Spider-Man finally go back on track with the previous Spider-Mans, motivated to become a much more mature, responsible, grown-up Spider-Man, and we instantly feel for him much more than we ever did. In the end of the movie, when everyone forgot about him, it functions similarly as a reboot, a pretty smart way without actually recasting anyone but to start over again. It provided the possibility of redemption, to make Tom Holland's Spider-Man sincere and likable this time. That being said, the whole setting of this film is still ridiculous, but that fault would lie on the previous creative decision rather than this film itself. I remember when I first watched Iron Man a decade ago, the most outbreaking plot twist was Iron Man referring his secret identity to the public. Superheroes always have a secret alter ego traditionally, and breaking that tradition was something I've never seen before in any superhero movies. From then on, all the Avengers don't really have secret identities anymore. They don't wear a mask, and thus they feel more like superstars than superheroes. Tony Stark was a military supplier who killed so many people indirectly, and no one ever truly held that against him, let alone Black Widows and Hawkeye killed many more when they worked as secret agents. Nobody ever brought that up. Now a decade later, the reveal of secret identities suddenly somehow become a big deal again. People harass Peter for an unconvicted crime after he helped save the world. And Avengers don't even help him clarify anything to the public. The fault definitely lies on MCU's earlier decision making, since they created this ridiculous plotline and arc in the first place. And No Way Home has to inherit them from the previous films that only handles Peter Parker in his little high school drama setting. The second usage of Aunt May's death is to provide Peter Parker with a spiritual guidance. Spider-Man is a good person because his uncle and aunt raised him as such, and taught him this famous slogan, "With great power comes great responsibility." Peter Parker wants to become Spider-Man because he was inspired by his uncle's morality. In the MCU, Uncle Ben was absent, and Aunt May was a comedy element who flirted with everyone and seemed more like a friend than parent to Peter. The MCU tried to replace Uncle Ben's guidance role with Tony Stark. This might have worked if Tony Stark was a serious, upright, old-fashioned father figure material. Well, I feel like I'm somewhat referring to Steve Rogers. Unfortunately, Tony was the redeemed but still self-absorbed, quirky playboy billionaire who wasn't exactly the perfect role model, nor was qualified to be a father until Avengers Endgame. Most scenes between Peter and Tony was rarely serious and had too few emotional payoffs, except this heartfelt moment before the blip in Infinity Wars, but their father and son relationship was still not convincing and sincere enough that Tony's death could actually result in an enormous pain and in-depth growth to Peter's character development. Aunt May didn't qualify to be Peter's spiritual guardians either, but in No Way Home they created this plot in which Aunt May lectured Peter to help people and put their needs above his wants. The saying, "with great power comes great responsibility," was also brought up again by her before her death. Aunt May set up quite an example for Peter to look up to this time. Her morality became the spiritual guidance Peter needed. Her death taught him a great lesson. Aunt May's death also provided real ethical dilemma for the protagonist. What should you do when being a superhero means sacrifice? This has been a very central conflict in the Sam Raimi's and Marc Webb films, but very much absent in MCU Spider-Man's films. Spider-Man has always been the moral center of the Marvel Universe. He's a regular teenager who crucially continues to be a part of society and function as a regular human being even after gaining his powers. And therefore his ethical dilemma is relatable and grounded on daily life. In the previous Spider-Man films, Spider-Man was always torn between moral motivation of helping others and the negative consequences of his action. Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker was a humble, good-hearted kid who was always being taught by Uncle Ben to help other people. He learned his lesson after his inethical behavior caused bad consequences. He avenged for Uncle Ben's death but regretted later on. So when he truly became Spider-Man, it was a combination of both good intention and consequentialism. Andrew Garfield's Peter's origin story was more complicated, and that's why it was a disaster when you mix so many things together. The first element drove Peter to be a superhero was bonding with his lost parents. Unlike Tobey Maguire's Peter, who was raised by a lovely couple into an old-school kind, upright young man, Andrew Garfield's Peter was clearly much lonelier and more troubled, struggling to find his place in life ever since his parents disappeared when he was a child. The second element was again Uncle Ben's death, which provided him the consequences of guilty act. But at this point he was less responsible and unlikable than Tobey Maguire's Peter, because the darkness and violence hidden behind his nature. It was until the point when he saves the kid on the bridge, he was provided with a moral motivation and thus truly becomes Spider-Man. Either way, both Peter Parker became Spider-Man with a combination of morality and consequentialism, while MCU Peter never learned from them until this movie. It always seems like him being a superhero was to have a bit of fun and proving himself to be a grown-up. It never seems that he had the strong motivation to be a superhero, probably because MCUs give his origin story. There was a bit consequentialism in Far From Home, but he still got other people to help him clean up his mess, and pretty much repeat the same mistake again in No Way Home. This time with Aunt May's given the moral example and her death caused actual consequences. The MCU finally brings back the Spider-Man ethical dilemma into the story. In fact, Peter caused Aunt May's death because he only considers his moral intention but not the consequences. If he wants to save the villains, bringing them home without some means to control them is certainly not the best way to handle it. In the end, he chooses not to tell his friends about his identity, it's due to the consideration of consequences. He doesn't want to bring back into danger again. So after No Way Home, Holland's Peter Parker can finally make his decision, considering both morality and consequences. No Way Home also brings out this interesting moral issue. Can villains be saved and redeemed? But they handled the issue with a childish thought. Spider-Man's villains are all driven by selfish immorality, uses their power for personal gain. The problem isn't their superpower, but their corrupted morality. Even if you erase their superpower, they wouldn't turn into a good person, especially for someone mentally ill like the Green Goblin. Would his evil side just fade away because he's lost his power? Just like the antidote in Black Widow, the solution MCU provides is always so shallow and don't really solve any mental practical problem, which I've discussed in my previous video before. Could Joker be fixed and redeemed? Although with childish woke fantasy about redeeming villains, Spider-Man No Way Home has still conveyed a clear ethical dilemma, which is the core conflict of a Spider-Man story, and rarely shown in any MCU movies. It's understandable the issue isn't deeply and maturely explored, since this is Marvel and not DC. Spider-Man No Way Home is already beyond fans' expectation and undoubtedly redeemed Holland's Spider-Man, create hopeful infinite possibilities for more future Spider-Man movies to come.